Part 6. The Nationalists' Triumph. The Constitution's Legacy. Chapter 37. The Bill of Rights. The Constitution had been ratified and was going into effect. And the next great question before the country was the spate of amendments which the Federalists had reluctantly agreed to recommend at the state conventions. Would they, as Madison and the other Federalists wanted, be quietly forgotten? The Anti-Federalists, particularly in Virginia and New York, would not permit that to happen, and the Second Convention movement, led by Patrick Henry and George Mason in Virginia, and proposed by the New York Convention circular letter, was the anti-federal goal. Already the circular letter had won approval from Virginia, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. A second convention would reopen the whole question of the Constitution and allow restrictive amendments and alterations which could severely weaken the rampant nationalism of the new government of the United States. For the same reason, a second convention was precisely what the victorious Federalists had to prevent at all costs. The Federalists, of course, wanted no part of any amendments or retainers of their promises. And Senator Ralph Izard, wealthy Federalist planter of South Carolina, expressed their sentiments at the first session of Congress, where he urged his colleagues to forget about their amendments and get down to problems of finance. James Madison, who defeated James Monroe in the Virginia elections to the House of Representatives and assumed the leadership of the Federalists in Congress, abhorred the concept of a Bill of Rights. But as a shrewd political tactician, he realized that the Second Convention movement could swell to formidable proportions. To avoid a potential crippling of the essentials of American nationalism, Madison decided that it was better to make some concessions right away, and thus pulled the teeth out of the drive for an overhaul of the Constitution before it really got underway. Madison also had a powerful political motive for making such concessions. Anti-federalism was powerful in Virginia, as had been demonstrated in Henry's almost successful attempt to keep the hated Madison out of Congress altogether. If he was to save his political hide in his home state, Madison had to act quickly, and in his hard-fought election campaign, he had pledged to work for such amendments in Congress. The approximately 210 amendments proposed by the states were of two basic kinds: a Bill of Rights for individuals and statehood reform to battle federal power. Typical of the former was trial by jury. Of the latter was two-thirds requirement for passing a navigation law. The former did not alarm the Federalists nearly as much as the latter, for the former would leave intact a supreme national power, banned only in specific instances from making certain incursions on the perceived liberty of the individual. But the statehood amendments could cut aggressively into the very political and economic vitals of the national juggernaut, and battle it effectively from within that power structure itself. The structural amendments would have expanded the libertarian scope of the Bill of Rights, from personal liberties alone to the political and economic. This was too much for the Federalists to swallow. Madison therefore decided to pass a Bill of Rights quickly, and thus nip in the bud any drive for structural reform and a second convention. He informed Congress that the anti-federal states and a Bill of Rights was fortunate, in that it would be possible to end this threat by granting such a bill, without endangering any part of the Constitution. If Congress refused to act, the public would be aroused, a second convention would be called, and the opposition could then force a reconsideration of the whole structure of government. On the other hand, as he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, submission of a Bill of Rights would weaken the opposition by splitting the moderates away from the radicals, i.e., the well-meaning from the designing opponents, fix on the latter their true character, and give to the government its due popularity and stability. After Washington's inaugural speech brusquely warned that amendments must not really weaken the power of national government, Madison introduced amendments that proposed a Bill of Rights, based on the proposed Virginia Amendments and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Indeed, he hastened to assure his intention of submitting the Bill of Rights amendments well in advance in order to forestall the next motion of Virginia's anti-federal congressman, Dr. Theodoric Bland, from introducing a resolution for a new constitutional convention. Madison's centrist action was predictably opposed from left and right. On the left, the anti-federal leadership understood Madison's tactic all too well. Senator William Grayson of Virginia wrote to Patrick Henry that Madison's amendments greatly overstressed personal liberty at the expense of reform of such matters as the direct tax power and the judiciary. The whole aspect of Madison's maneuver, wrote Grayson, was unquestionably to break the spirit of the Anti-Federalist Party by divisions. The maneuver succeeded all too well, as many in the anti-federal bloc were ready to settle for a small part of the loaf and then give in to the new Constitution. Even George Mason was almost willing to reconcile himself to the new government. In North Carolina, Madison's introduction of the Bill of Rights proved instrumental in changing enough anti-federal support to ratify the Constitution. On the other side, many Federalists were unconvinced of the necessity for this maneuver. In the House, Roger Sherman attacked the idea of amendments and upheld stability of government above all else. And the ultra-federalist Fisher Ames sneered at Madison's amendment effort as based on research into personal trivia and designed to advance Madison's personal popularity. Georgia's James Jackson was already divinizing a constitution not quite a year old. The Constitution, he argued, must be left intact. Otherwise, a patchwork flood of amendments might follow. The fact that the Constitution itself was a patchwork seemed to be lost on the Georgia congressman. Perhaps the most extreme expression in the House came from former Judge Samuel Livermore, who had pledged a key vote in ratifying the Constitution in New Hampshire. The judge was outraged about the restraints involved in prohibiting cruel and unusual punishments in the Bill of Rights. Livermore couldn't understand why necessary and salutary punishments should be prohibited merely because they were cruel. A gallant anti-federal stand in the House was led by Adonis Burke and Thomas Tucker of South Carolina. Burke and Tucker urged the inclusion of libertarian structural amendments, such as the prohibition of federal direct taxes, but their efforts were in vain. Tucker also tried in vain to include expressly before delegated in the 10th Amendment, thus greatly limiting the power granted to Congress. Finally, after long and reluctant delay, the House passed 17 restrictive amendments on August 24, 1789. In the Senate, the Libertarian Anti-Federalist fight was led by the two Virginia senators, Richard Henry Lee and William Grayson. Lee and Grayson followed the Tucker-Burke path by introducing structural amendments. Indeed, they introduced a mixture of the amendments proposed by the Virginia Convention. They also added a proposal to prohibit federal direct taxes. All of these were rejected by the Senate. The most creative and daringly democratic amendment was to bind representatives to follow the instructions of their constituents. But in all the Senate, only Lee and Grayson had the vision to support it. However, while Lee well understood the Machiavellian political reasons for the amendments, he concluded at the end that half a loaf was better than none. Lee, however, remained highly critical of the way in which his colleagues had inhibited and enfeebled the amendments. The hardline Federalists who scorned any concessions were led in the Senate by Ralph Izard of South Carolina, John Langdon of New Hampshire, and the ineffable Robert Morris of Pennsylvania. The Senate condensed the House amendments into 12, and a joint conference committee submitted final revisions of the 12 amendments, which were approved by the Congress on September 25. The hardcore anti-federalists were chagrined. Lee was critical. Grayson bitterly concluded that the submitted Bill of Rights amendments would do more harm than good. Patrick Henry agreed, lamenting the lack of a prohibition of direct taxes, and tried to postpone the ratification of the amendments by the Virginia House. Even the moderate Federalist Thomas Jefferson, though favoring the Bill of Rights, was disgruntled at the lack of a prohibition on government grants of monopoly and a standing army. Patrick Henry's gallant fight against the overly soft amendments and the shrewd Madisonian strategy was able to delay Virginia's ratification until it became the last of the 11 states needed to approve. New Jersey was the first state to ratify in late November 1789, but while 9 states moved to ratify by June 1790, Virginia, the last state, took over 2 years after submission. In Virginia, the struggle was waged between the lower house, now controlled by the Federalists, and the anti-Federalist controlled Senate, which was finally pressured into ratifying on December 15, 1791. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Georgia never did ratify. Georgia on the High Federalist belief that they were unnecessary, and Connecticut on the equally ultra-federalist view that any concession would imply that the Constitution was not unflawed perfection, and would therefore give aid and comfort to anti-federalism. In Massachusetts, too, the Federalists wanted no amendments, while the anti-federals held out for stronger amendments. Between the two forces, Massachusetts never ratified. Of the 12 amendments submitted to the states, the first 2 were not ratified. These were minor provisions dealing with the organization of Congress. The remaining 10 amendments composed 9 highly significant articles guaranteeing various personal liberties against the federal government, as well as 1 complementary structural amendment. None of the political and economic liberties desired by the anti-federalists, prohibition of direct taxes, standing army, 2/3 requirement for laws regulating commerce, etc., were included. But the adopted Bill of Rights was significant enough, and all of their provisions were intensely libertarian. The First Amendment provided that Congress shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting its free exercise, abridging freedom of speech, press, or right of peaceful assembly, or to petition the government for redress of grievances. The Second Amendment guaranteed that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. While the courts have enumerated the clause to apply only to Congress, leaving the states free to invade this right, the wording makes it clear that the right shall not be infringed, period. Since states are mentioned in the body of the Constitution and restrictions placed upon them there as well, this clause evidently also applies to the states. Indeed, the subsequent amendments, 3 to 9, apply to the states as well as to the federal government. Only the First Amendment specifically restricts Congress alone. And yet the courts have emasculated the amendments in the same way, counting them as not applying to the invasions of personal liberty by the states. The Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of troops in peacetime in a private house without the owner's consent. The Fourth guarantees the rights of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and only specific warrants, not general ones, can be issued. The Fifth Amendment ensures grand jury indictments for major crimes and prohibits double jeopardy, compelling any defendant to testify against himself, depriving anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or confiscating private property without just compensation. The Sixth Amendment ensures the right of a defendant to a quick and public trial by an impartial jury of the locality of the crime, and to have various other rights in his trial. The Seventh guarantees the right of trial by jury in civil cases, and the Eighth prohibits excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishments. The Ninth and 10th Amendments were signed to give the stark rebuttal to the cynical Wilson-Madison-Hamilton argument that a Bill of Rights impairs people's rights by permitting encroachment in unenumerated rights that would supposedly belong to the people. The 10th Amendment specifies that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This amendment specifies that the national government is one of strictly delegated powers, and that powers not so delegated belong to the states or to the people. In other words, the power not specifically delegated or prohibited to the federal government cannot be assumed by that government and are reserved to the states. For many years, the 10th Amendment was the great weapon of the states' rightists and other anti-nationalists in their argument that the states or the people of the states are really sovereign, rather than the national government. This amendment did in truth transform the Constitution from one of supreme national power to a partially mixed polity, where the liberal anti-nationalists had a constitutional argument with at least a fighting chance of acceptance. However, Madison had cunningly left out the words expressly before the word delegated, so the nationalist judges were able to claim that because the word expressly was not there, the delegated can vaguely accrue through judges' elastic interpretation of the Constitution. This loophole for vague delegated power allowed the national courts to use such open-ended claims as general welfare, commerce, national supremacy, and necessary and proper to argue for almost any delegation of power that is not specifically prohibited to the federal government. In short, to return the Constitution basically to what it was before the 10th Amendment was passed. The 10th Amendment had been intensely reduced by conventional judiciary construction to a meaningless tautology. Ironically, the most potentially explosive weapon of the anti-nationalists was ignored then and for the next 175 years by the public and the courts. This was the Ninth Amendment, which states, "The enumeration in the Congress of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people," with its stress on the rights of the people rather than on state or federal power, as in the 10th Amendment. The Ninth Amendment is even more acutely the answer to the Wilsonian argument than the 10th. The enumeration of rights may not be so construed as to deny other unenumerated rights retained by the people. The Ninth Amendment has unfortunately, A, erroneously been held to apply only to the federal government and not also to the states, and B, has been reduced to a simple paraphrase of the 10th Amendment by the courts. But then why have a Ninth Amendment that simply repeats the 10th? In truth, the Ninth Amendment is very different, and no construction can reduce it to a tautology. Unlike the formulaic 10th Amendment, the Ninth emphatically asserts that there are rights which are retained by the people, and therefore may not be infringed upon by any area of government. But if there are unenumerated rights, this means that it is the constitutional obligation of the courts to find, proclaim, and protect them. Moreover, it means that it is unconstitutional for the courts to allow a government infringement on any right of the individual, on the grounds that no express prohibition of that act can be found in the Constitution. The Ninth Amendment is an open invitation, nay, a command, to the people to discover and protect the unenumerated rights, and never to allow governmental invasion of rights on the grounds that no express prohibition can be found. In short, the Ninth Amendment expressly commands the judge to be activist and not literal in the construction of rights retained by the people against government encroachment. Moreover, if it is asked what other rights were intended, the context of the time dictates but one answer. They meant the natural rights held by every human being. But a commandment that courts are duty-bound to protect all of man's natural rights, enumerated or retained, would reduce the powerful scope of government action to such a degree as to give the last laugh to Herbert Spencer over Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was in the early 20th century to twist the strict constitutional judges of their day from holding that the Constitution endowed the individualist libertarian social philosophy of Spencer's Social Statics, 1851. While the taunt was directed against enabling the judge's personal preferences into fundamental law, the spelling out of the implications of the Ninth Amendment might well reinstate social statics, and on a far firmer legal and constitutional basis. Misconstrued as it was, the Ninth Amendment lay forgotten and made no impact whatever on American history until the year 1965. Then, suddenly, the Supreme Court, in a landmark of constitutional law, rediscovered the lost amendment and relied on it in Griswold v. Connecticut 1965 to prohibit the states from interfering with the individual's basic and fundamental right to marital privacy in outlawing birth control devices. The enormous implications of the decision for constitutional law and for wider liberty in the U.S. were adumbrated in the concurring opinion of the Justice Arthur Goldberg, agreed to by the Justice William Brennan and Chief Justice Earl Warren. The concept of liberty protects those personal rights that are fundamental, and is not confined to the specific terms of the Bill of Rights. My conclusion that the concept of liberty is not so restricted, and that it embraces the right of marital privacy, though that right is not mentioned explicitly in the Constitution, is supported by both numerous decisions of this Court, referred to in the Court's opinion, and by the language and history of the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment to the Constitution may be regarded by some as a recent discovery, and may be forgotten by others. But since 1791, it has been a basic part of the Constitution which we are sworn to uphold. To hold that it is a right so basic and fundamental and so deep-rooted in our society as the right of privacy in marriage may be infringed, because that right is not guaranteed in so many words by the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, is to ignore the 9th Amendment, and to give it no effect whatsoever. Moreover, a judicial construction that this fundamental right is not protected by the Constitution because it is not mentioned in explicit terms by one of the first 8 amendments or elsewhere in the Constitution would violate the 9th Amendment. Rather, as the 9th Amendment expressly recognizes, there are fundamental personal rights such as this one, which are protected from abridgment by the government, though not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Chapter 38. Was the U.S. Constitution radical? It was a bloodless coup d'etat against an unresisting Confederation Congress. The original structure of the new Constitution was now complete. The Federalists, by use of propaganda, chicanery, fraud, malapportionment of delegates, blackmail threats of secession, and even coercive laws, had managed to sustain enough delegates to defy the wishes of the majority of the American people and create a new Constitution. The drive was managed by a core of brilliant members and representatives of the financial and landed oligarchy. These wealthy merchants and large landowners were joined by the urban artisans of the large cities in their drive to create a strong overriding central government, a supreme government with its own absolute power to tax, regulate commerce, and raise armies. These powers were sought eagerly as a method of handing out special privileges to commercial groups, navigation acts to subsidize shipping, tariffs to protect inefficient artisans stampeded by national depression from foreign manufactured goods, a strong army and navy to pursue an aggressive foreign policy designed to force the opening of West Indies ports, the Mississippi River, and the Northwest. And to pay for all of these bounties, a central taxing power would be harnessed that could also assume and pay the public debt held by wealthy speculators. But government by its nature cannot supply bounties and privileges without taking them from others. And these others were to be largely the hapless bulk of the nation's citizens, the inland subsistence farmers. In western Massachusetts, taxes to pay a heavy public debt owed by wealthy men in the East had produced Shays' Rebellion. Now a new super-government was emerging and carrying out on a national scale the mercantilist principle of taxation, regulation, and special privilege for the benefit of favored groups, the few, at the expense of the bulk of producers and consumers in the country, the many. And while to acquire sufficient support, they had to purchase allies among the mass of the people, example, urban artisans. The major concentration of benefits and privileges would undoubtedly accrue to America's aristocracy. As part of the agreed-to division of the coming spoils, the Northern Nationalists, though permanently abhorring slavery in a region where it was not viable and was being abolished, rather swiftly moved to protect and even encourage slavery in other regions in order to obtain support of the Southern Nationalists and thus the Constitution. To these nationalist leaders, abandoning the slave to his fate was a small price to pay for a strong central government, to further markets for Northern merchants and shippers. Dispute has long raged among historians as to whether the Constitution was the completion, the fulfillment of the spirit of the American Revolution, or whether it was a counter-revolution against that spirit. But surely it is clear that the Constitution was profoundly counter-revolutionary. The American Revolution has in recent years been depicted by revisionist historians as solely a struggle for independence against Great Britain on behalf of rather abstract principles of constitutional law. But legal principles are seldom passionately held and fought for, unless instinctively bound up with conflicts in politico-economic reality. The Americans were not anti-British. On the contrary, the need to declare independence was acknowledged very late and almost reluctantly. The Americans were struggling not primarily for independence, but for political economic liberty against the mercantilism of the British Empire. The struggle was waged against taxes, prohibitions, and regulations, a whole failure of repression that the Americans, upheld by an ideology of liberty, had fought and torn asunder. It was only when independence was clearly necessary to achieve their goals did the American Revolution take final form. In other words, the American Revolution was in essence not so much against Britain as against British big government, and specifically against an all-powerful central government and a supreme executive. In short, the American Revolution was liberal, democratic, and quasi-anarchistic. For decentralization, free markets, and individual liberty. For natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Against monarchy, mercantilism, and especially against strong central government. From the very beginning of that revolution, and even before, wealthy financial oligarchs in New York and Philadelphia, beginning with Benjamin Franklin, had toyed with the idea of a strong central government in America that would grant them mercantilist powers over the people. In the last phase of the war, Robert Morris, the grandfather of the Constitution, came within an inch of imposing a nationalist mercantilist regime upon a revolutionary nation fighting for its existence. The Articles of Confederation were themselves a concession to nationalism, as against the original Continental Congress. But basically, they had kept the Congress chained to a leash, and so nationalist power was checked. But with the post-war breakup of the liberal Adams-Lee junto, the aftermath of wartime destruction, and the opportunity provided by the Depression of the mid-1780s, the nationalists fished in troubled waters and succeeded in imposing a counter-revolution. It had also been charged by recent historians that there was really no continuity between the contending forces during the Revolution, radicals versus conservatives, and the opposing camps in the struggle over the Constitution. But in the first place, the continuity of ideas is striking. From the very beginning, it was the dream of the right, once remaining with the British government became impossible, to remold America into a form as close as possible to the powerful government of Great Britain. In leadership personnel, the sticking point is that the right in 1776, the ones most reluctant to break with England, the Morrises, the Dickinsons, the Jays, the Schuylers, in short, the Philadelphia and New York oligarchy, along with the Pendletons and Washingtons in Virginia, were the leaders of the reaction throughout the period, and the leaders in the drive for a constitution. The leaders of the right in 1776 were also the leaders of the right in 1789. The difference between the two periods and the significant break in continuity was the shift of large numbers of radical leaders during the war into the conservative ranks a decade later. Indeed, one of the prior reasons for the defeat of the Anti-Federalists, though they commanded a majority of the public, was the decimation that had taken place in radical and liberal leadership during the 1780s. A whole galaxy of ex-radicals, ex-decentralists, and ex-libertarians found in their old age that they could comfortably live in the new establishment. The list of such defections is impressive, including John Adams, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Benjamin Rush, Thomas Paine, Alexander McDougall, Isaac Sears, and Christopher Gadsden. Perhaps an explanation of many of the defectors, Sam Adams, Sears, McDougall, Gadsden, and Paine, was the rightward shift of the big city artisans who provided these men with their political power base. Conversely, the left in 1788 was very apt to have been on the left in the early years of the Revolution. Among those faithful to the liberal cause, Luther Martin, James Warren, Elbridge Gerry, George Clinton, Abraham Yates, generally the Clintonians in New York, the Constitutionalist Party in Pennsylvania fighting against the counterinsurgency of the conservative Republican Party, except for defections like Paine, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Person of the old radical regulator movement in North Carolina. An important test of this hypothesis would be to find individuals or groups who were on the right in 1776, but had shifted sharply leftward by 1788. Prominent men in that category are undoubtedly rare indeed. If then the Constitution was a counter-revolution, what kind of a reactionary movement was it? Contrary to the famous Beard thesis, it was not at all a struggle between a sound money creditor class against a small farmer debtor class, in favor of inflation and paper money. These were categories that Beard impermissibly smuggled from his experience of the monetary struggles of the late 19th century. It is impermissible to speak of debtor and creditor classes, for these are categories that shift from month to month and even day to day. Consequently, while it is true that paper money is likely to be favored by debtors, The aggressive debtors were far more likely to be wealthy merchants and great planters than rural farmers far removed from the seats of financial and political power. Wealthy mercantilists have higher credit ratings, can do more with borrowed money, and have much stronger political connections that allow them to secure favorable legislation. In truth, most groups, especially most of the wealthy, favored paper money. The difference became largely in the ways in which that money could be emitted and in whether legal tender laws would accompany them. The oppressive form of debt against which, for example, the Shayscites rebelled was not private debt but public debt, i.e., against the fastening of a Revolutionary War debt owned by the wealthier classes upon the masses and small farmers who would be taxed to pay for it. The constitutional counter-revolution, then, was not a struggle of sound money men against inflationists or creditors against debtors. Jackson Turner Main's brilliant demonstration that it was a conflict of commercial versus non-commercial factions can be subsumed under a broader truth. It was, as Patrick Henry grasped, a struggle of power and privilege, and to a lesser extent of aristocracy against democracy. Those familiar categories can also be subsumed in the liberty versus power dichotomy. For while aristocracy was the most determined to acquire special privileges, they could not have won without the lures of apparent privileges offered to the urban artisans. Contrary to Forrest MacDonald, the Anti-Federalists have received a poor historical press, and even the most supposedly extreme Anti-Federalist historian dedicated his book on the formation of the Constitution to James Madison. He concludes his book as follows. Today, Americans continue to debate, as they have ever since the 18th century, about the division of power between the states and the central government, and about the role the latter should play in the economy and social life of the nation. Such debate had validity in an earlier and simpler age, but it is now little more than a romantic exercise. Although the Constitution itself remains what it was, the realities of political life in the 20th century have created an all-powerful national government in fact. And Stoughton Lynd, though utilizing the commercial non-commercial view of the struggle, and sympathetic to the individualist libertarianism of the Anti-Federalists, concludes that federalism was right by turning to positive planful government, to promote, guide, and discipline all economic enterprise towards national goals. All this was justified, and even an aggressive internationalist policy was needed to protect American economic independence and secure national economic development. Professor Cecilia Kina has derided the Anti-Federalists as men of little faith, i.e., little faith in political power. Some recent historians have termed the Federalists radicals and liberal reformers, and the Anti-Federalists conservatives, because the Federalists favored a sharp change in the status quo, while the Anti-Federalists did not. But to base the concept of radicals versus conservatives solely on the formal fact of change, regardless of context, is to A. blur the critical difference between revolution and counter-revolution, and B. to arrive at such conceptual absurdities as designating Francisco Franco's rebellion in the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s as radical, while the Spanish loyalists were conservative. But the point is that this little faith was precisely in the tradition of the American Revolution Bernard Bailyn writes of the revolutionary thinkers. Most commonly, the discussion of power centered on its essential characteristics of aggressiveness, its endlessly propulsive tendency to expand itself beyond legitimate boundaries. The image most commonly used was that of the act of trespassing. Power, it was said over and over again, has an encroaching nature. Power is grasping and tenacious in its nature. What it seizes, it will retain. Sometimes power is like the ocean, not easily admitting limits to be fixed in it. Sometimes it is like a cancer. It eats faster and faster every hour. It is everywhere in public life, and everywhere it is threatening, pushing, and grasping. And too often in the end, it destroys its benign, necessarily benign victim. What gave transcendent importance to the aggressiveness of power was the fact that its natural prey, its necessary victim, was liberty, or law, or right. The public world these writers saw was divided into distinct, contrasting, and innately antagonistic spheres. The sphere of power and the sphere of liberty or right. The one was brutal, ceaselessly active, and heedless. The other was delicate, passive, and sensitive. The one must be resisted, the other defended, and the two must never be confused. The Federalists, on the other hand, in their faith in quasi-monarchical power, especially with themselves in the driver's seat, are strongly reminiscent of the Tories, another indication of continuity in the ideological struggle and of the Federalist movement as a reaction against the spirit of the American Revolution. Forrest MacDonald is the latest historian to treat the adoption of the Constitution as a counter-revolution in restoring Toryism. However, in contrast to earlier historians of a similar view, MacDonald extravagantly eulogizes this process. Apparently for MacDonald, the American Revolution was the first step down the inevitable road to Bolshevism, a fate from which America was saved only by the miracle of all ages to come, of the Federalists, giants who spoke in the name of the nation. Happily for MacDonald, the giants triumphed instead of those who, in 1787 and 1788, spoke in the name of the people and of popular rights. Overall, it should be evident that the Constitution was a counter-revolutionary reaction to the libertarianism and decentralization embodied in the American Revolution. The Anti-Federalists, supporting states' rights and critical of a strong national government, were decisively beaten by the Federalists, who wanted such a polity under the guise of democracy in order to enhance their own interests and institute a British-style mercantilism over the country. Most historians have taken the side of the Federalists because they support a strong national government that has the power to tax and regulate, call forth armies and invade other countries, and cripple the power of the states. The enactment of the Constitution in 1788 drastically changed the course of American history from its natural decentralized and libertarian direction to an omnipresent Leviathan that fulfilled all of the anti-Federalist spheres. With the ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the new government was now a fact, and the Anti-Federalists would never again agitate for another constitutional convention to weaken American national power and return to a more decentralized and restrained polity. From now on, American liberals, relying on the Bill of Rights and the 10th Amendment, would go forth and do battle for liberty and against power within the framework of the American Constitution as states' writers and constitutionalists. Their battle would be a long and gallant one, but ultimately doomed to fail. For by accepting the Constitution, the liberals would only play with dice loaded implacably against them. The Constitution, with its inherently broad powers and elastic clauses, would increasingly support an ever larger and more powerful central government. In the long run, the liberals, though they could and did run a gallant race, were doomed to lose. And lose indeed they did. In a sense, the supposedly unrealistic radicals, who would totally reject the Constitution and try to rend it asunder, in different ways and from very different perspectives. Example, the Whiskey Rebels, William Lloyd Garrison, John Brown, and the secessionists of the South, would be far more perceptive about the realities and the potentials of the American constitutional system than those liberals working within it. This has been Conceived in Liberty, Volume 5, The New Republic, 1784 to 1791. Written by Murray Rothbard. Narrated by Millian Quinteros.